Welcome to our third lecture covering Chapter 11. The topic of this chapter is third-party contracts. As you know, we've already covered the topic of third-party beneficiary contracts. And we've also discussed assignments. And so our remaining topic is delegations. So we're going to speed forward along and get to our delegation section. When we talk about delegations, or as you're learning about delegations, probably the most tricky part about delegations is being able to distinguish them from assignments. Remember, assignments have to do with assets and delegations have to do with duties. So obviously assignment starts with A, asset starts with A, delegation starts with a D, duty starts with a D. So as you're thinking through these terms, that can help you keep those straight. So let's begin our discussion, or at least maybe continue our discussion of delegations. So here we have the picture for assignments. We have an obligor who owes a duty to someone that he's entered into a contract with. So again, this is the original contract. The obligee and obligor are in privity. They have a contract. Obviously, they have mutual obligations. This guy's an obligor to the obligee, but this obligee has obligations to the obligor. But we're focusing on one particular obligation, and for that one particular obligation, the obligor owes a duty to the obligee. The obligee has chosen to assign that duty, not sign the duty, but sign the right to receive that duty to an assignee. So this obligee becomes an assignor, and he or she assigns the duty to the assignee. So now the obligor doesn't have the duty to the obligee anymore, but actually has the duty to the assignee. It looks very similar when you look at the delegation. This time, though, we have the obligor again. He owes a duty to the obligee. So this part right here looks pretty much the same, right? But this time he is choosing to delegate that duty to somebody else. We're calling that person the delegatee. And so now, instead of the obligor performing that duty for the person with whom he is in privity with, now this delegatee is going to do it. Now you can see that this delegatee is probably not doing this out of the goodness of his heart. I mean, I guess he could be, but that's probably not the likely scenario. The most common way that we have delegations is when there's also an assignment, and we'll talk about how that plays out going forward. But keep in mind that it's not either or. It's not, gosh, I either have a delegation or I have an assignment. You can have just a delegation and you can have just an assignment, or you can have both. And probably the more common scenario is having both. Okay, so let's talk about the nitty-gritty about delegations. So again, this is the transfer of some kind of contractual duty, and it can be a duty that actually involves some significant work, such as, I don't know, building a building or mowing a lawn. But it can also be something like paying money. I mean, you might not even say, well, that's not exactly a duty. I mean, it's super easy to do. I mean, if you have the money, it's super easy to do. So we're not necessarily talking about something that's hard or onerous. It's doing whatever the contract provided. So when do you need a writing when a delegation is involved? We have the same answer for delegation that we had for assignment. You only need to have it in writing if that particular type of delegation is a topic that the statute of frauds covers. So if I am, as part of my, if my delegation or my duty under the contract is to convey property to you, real property, well then under those circumstances, yes, it has to be in writing. Not because it's a delegation, but because any transaction involving real property has to be in writing. So you have to look to the substance of the delegation to know whether it has to be in writing or not. Again, just a little refresher, even if it doesn't have to be in writing, it's still a really good idea to reduce it into writing. I have a typo here, I apologize. It should be statute of frauds. Don't know what I was thinking there. So again, focus on the substance to decide whether statute of frauds applies or not. When we were talking about assignments, we talked about, let me just flip back here, we talked about how this guy, the obligee, really falls out of the equation. He isn't entitled to whatever is being assigned. it now goes to the assignee. So he's not even kind of a factor in this type of equation going forward. That's not what happens with a delegation. Even though the delegatee is the one that we're expecting to perform the duty, the obligor, the delegator, continues to have responsibilities because after all, the obligor is the person who entered into the contract with the obligee. This delegatee is a stranger to the obligee. It could well be that the delegatee does a terrible job doing the duty. And so the obligee says, wait a second, delegatee, you're a lousy doer of whatever it is. Maybe it's paint a painting. You're a lousy painter. I hired the obligor here because he's a great painter, and I paid extra maybe because I wanted his awesome services. And so I want to sue you, delegatee, for doing a bad job, but I also want to sue this guy because he's the guy I entered into the contract with. I mean, it might be this delegatee doesn't have any money, so there's really no advantage for the obligee to sue the delegatee for the poor job that the delegatee did. But maybe the obligor slash delegator has big bucks, and so it makes sense for the obligee to sue. So in this scenario, he is definitely still in the equation, even though he's done the delegation. That is a big, big difference between an assignment and a delegation. He's out of the equation when we have an assignment, but the delegator remains someone who can be sued, who is responsible for the quality of the work that the delegatee does under those circumstances. The delegation may not be effective if the duty is personal in nature if a particular skill is required. You may require, when we were talking about assignments, we said, gosh, the law loves assignments. It is not going to limit the ability of a contractor to assign an asset in the vast majority of cases. We believe in free assignment in our free market economy. Delegations are also routinely upheld, but there's more of a recognition that the obligee, since he's trying to get something out of this deal, kind of cares who's doing it. I mean, if I hire, Claude Monet to paint a painting for myself, and you hire Claude Monet's second cousin once removed, George Monet, who can't paint at all, it's not the same thing. It's just not. And so Claude Monet delegating the duty to a second cousin George is not going to be counted as a delegation because he doesn't have the same skill set. It could even be that I hire Claude Monet to do the painting and he persuades Jackson Pollock to do it instead. Obviously, they weren't alive at the same time, but let's just imagine. Jackson Pollock's an awesome artist, but he paints in a different style. And so it's not even necessary that Jackson Pollock is a worse or better artist than Claude Monet. He just has a different approach. And so it could be just a personal taste difference that makes one person prefer one artist over another. And so if it's personal in nature or if a particular skill is required, then it's reasonable for the delegation not to go forward. Personal in nature thing might be, let's say that I am hiring somebody to be my masseur. Maybe I prefer a person of the same sex, or maybe I prefer someone whom I know fairly well, who I'm going to be more comfortable, having touched my body and maybe me being in some state of undress. So I might prefer Sally masseuse to Bob masseur, not meaning anything bad about Bob, but just that's not my comfort level. And so when it's a personal service, that's another situation in which delegation may not be effective. So courts are more hesitant to enforce a delegation than an assignment, but keep in mind, if we're talking about an arm's length business deal, and especially when we don't have some kind of specialized skill, courts still like to enforce delegations. So it's not a situation in which delegations are rarely enforced, delegations are routinely enforced. Okay, so let's look at our scenario. You may recall this from a similar story that we had with assignments. Let's go through this. So we have our initial contract here. We have two people in privity. We have Al and we have Bob. Al agrees to pay Bob $100 and Bob agrees to give Al a TV. And they reduce this to a contract. They've decided to wait 2 weeks until the TV is ready to be delivered before anyone exchanges anything. So you can see this is pretty much the same deal that we had when we were talking about assignments, but now things are going to get different. So the rest of the story is pretty different. During those 2 weeks, Al delegates his duty to pay the $100 to Ron. So in our previous example, we had Bob assigning the right to the income, but now we are saying that Al is going to delegate the duty to pay. And so instead of Al having the duty to pay Bob, I mean, he still has it, but now the focus is on Ron, I'm sorry. Ron is going to pay Bob the $100. Now, why does Ron agree to do this? Well, we're told it's because that Ron already owed Al $100 for some completely separate transaction, maybe that happened 6 months ago. Ron's been owing Al some money. Al now owes Bob money because once Bob pays or gives him Al the TV, then Al needs to pay Bob the $100. Al starts saying, I could pay Bob myself, but why don't I just have Ron do it? Ron owes me $100. So Al calls up Ron and says, hey Ron, you've been owing me that $100 for a while. It's time for you to pay up. You're going to pay Bob the $100 that I'm going to owe Bob when he delivers the TV, and that's going to satisfy your debt to me. So let's go over the lingo. Al is the person with the obligation. He's the obligor. He owes the obligation of paying the $100. Now, as is usually the case in a contract, Bob is an obligor and he's an obligee. Al is an obligor and he's an obligee. Bob's obligation, he's an obligor with respect to the TV. Al is an obligee with respect to the TV. But the TV isn't what's at issue in the delegation. What's at issue in the delegation is this payment of $100. For this particular issue, Al is the obligor and Bob is the obligee. So we're focusing on this part of the equation, and so we're going to call Al the obligor and Bob the obligee. You could also call Al the promisor and Bob the promisee. Al has chosen to delegate his duty to pay the $100 to Ron, which makes Ron the delegatee. And then this is the duty. And now we have this other element which explains why Ron's willing to do this. So hopefully this makes sense, kind of what's going on under these circumstances. Again, the language, the definitions is probably the trickiest part about this. Okay, so let's compare an assignment with a delegation. Of course, the first difference is an assignment of rights, or, just to make it even easier, assets. Remember though, I'm probably not going to use assets on tests because that makes it almost too easy. But we have assets with first 3 letters. First 3 letters are good. Delegation is a transfer of duties, D and D. The statute of frauds rule is the same with either one. We just look at the substance of whatever is being assigned or delegated. If statute of frauds doesn't apply, you don't need it. This is the difference. The assigner's right to the asset goes poof at the second of the assignment, but the delegator's duty doesn't go poof when he delegates. I'm going to say even if, may be effective even if there's a contractual limitation. So it's harder to persuade a court not to enforce an assignment. Delegation's still probably going to be enforced, but at least there's a better chance that the court isn't going to enforce it. But there is this one caveat. It may not be effective if it's personal. And the delegation is a little bit bigger. It may not be effective if it's personal or it's professional in nature. Okay, so this is kind of a comparison between the two. This is a good slide 27, to keep in mind when you want to kind of go through and make sure you understand what are the differences between assignment and delegation. This would be an example. We have a king here. Look at this king. He seems unable or unwilling to delegate his assignments. Presumably there's someone in the kingdom who could be painting the stripes on the road instead of the king. Though this would be an example of something that he ought to delegate. It's a little funny, kind of, a little bit funny. Okay, so now we're going to talk not about delegations, but we're going to contrast something that is very similar to a delegation. It has a lot of things in common, but it is also different than a delegation. And I want to go through this because it can get to be a little bit confusing, and it's important to be able to distinguish these. We've talked about novations before, but we're going to do just a bit of a refresher on this. So what is a novation? The way that I remember it is that it's like the word innovation. You put the IN in front of it, we have the word innovation. And when I think of innovation, I think of something new. Maybe it's an invention. An innovation might be, if you're Thomas Edison, it might be the light bulb. If you're Alexander Graham Bell, it might be, the telephone. It's an invention, an innovation, a new thing. Well, that's what innovation is. It's something new too. But it's not an invention, it's a new contract. It's a substituted contract that dissolves a previous contractual obligation and creates a new one. So a novation replaces the original contract with a new one. When a novation happens, the other contract goes away. It is not enforceable by anyone. And it's going to release the original parties to the contract. They have no continuing obligations under the original contract. Now, it's very likely that some, possibly all of the people to the original contract will be in the new contract. So they may well still have continuing obligations, but they don't have exactly the same obligations they had under the original contract. Usually all of the people in the original contract and the people in the new contract, have to agree to this whole deal. Many times the terms of the novation may be the same as the original contract, or they may be pretty different. Okay, so before we go into this one, let's look at do I have it here? Yeah. Let's look at this novation example. So the original contract is we'll put a box around it. We'll go back to slide 30, so I'm not going to forget it, I promise. So this is our original contract. Al and Bob are in privity with each other. Al agrees to pay Bob $1,000, and Bob agrees to paint Al's fence. That must be some fence for $1,000. So we can see that Al has the obligation to pay $1,000, and Bob has the obligation to paint the fence. Unfortunately for Bob, he gets sick, and he asks Al, "Hey, Al, I've got this friend Ron. Ron's willing to paint the fence for you for the $100. Al maybe does a check of, Ron's business credentials, maybe get some letters of reference, and Al goes, "You know what? I'm okay with that. Bob, you're not able to perform the contract, so what we'll do is we'll just make this contract go away. It's like it never even happened. Bob, you have no obligations anymore. We're tearing up this contract. I don't have any obligations to you. You don't have any obligations to me. And now I, Al, am going to enter into a contract with Ron. And in that contract, Ron agrees to do what Bob was supposed to do. He agrees to paint the fence. And I, Al, agree to pay Ron $1,000. So in this contract, it's exactly the same terms. The only difference is that it's not Bob anymore, it's Ron. Bob has no obligations under this new contract. Ron had no obligations under the original contract. But now we've replaced this original contract with a novation. Everybody has to agree. Bob has to agree because after all, he's not going to get the $1,000. Maybe he's not that sick. Maybe he could go ahead and paint it if he wanted, if he had to. And so Bob has to agree to forego the $1,000. Al has to agree to accept Ron's painting. After all, initially Al wanted Bob to paint. Maybe Bob is a super awesome painter of fences. Maybe Ron's not so good. Well, Al gets to make that judgment. He can say, "Nope, don't really want Ron to paint my fence," and he can put a stop to this transaction. Of course, Ron also has to agree. I mean, if Ron doesn't want to paint Al's fence, Bob and Al can't make Ron paint the fence. So all three of the people have to agree to this. And by the way, in this story, we're going to say that Ron's name is White. He's going to paint the fence white and his last name is White, just so we can keep things straight. I realize he's yellow here, but we're going to pretend that his surname is White so we can keep things straight. So Ron White is painting the fence as part of the novation. Now you may say, how is this different than a delegation? Because let's go back and let's imagine a different scenario. Let's say this was instead a delegation. So Al and Ron enter into this. Let me just clear this so we can. Here we go. We're going to, there we go. So we're back to our original contract between Al and Bob. And Bob decides he wants to delegate his duty to paint the fence. I mean, maybe Bob is sick, or maybe for whatever reason, but we'll say he's sick. And so he wants to delegate his duty to Ron. He doesn't want to try the novation. He just wants to do a delegation. And so he delegates the duty to Ron. But he also delegates the asset that he's expecting to get, the $1,000. So he delegates the duty of painting the fence, but he also assigns the asset of the $1,000 to Ron. Ron shows up. He does a great job painting the fence. Al's happy with the work. Ron has given Al notice of the assignment, and so Al pays Ron the $1,000. Everybody's happy. It worked out just fine. So you might say, well, what's the difference between a delegation of both the a delegation of the duty and assignment of the asset? What's the difference between that and a novation? The main difference is poor Bob here. If it's a delegation and an assignment, Bob remains on the hook for the delegation because Al didn't get the opportunity to approve Ron. Remember, Bob on his own did the delegation. I mean, maybe Ron's an awful painter. Maybe he doesn't know what he's doing. Ron White doesn't know how to paint worth anything. So Bob's very skillful fence painter. Ron White's awful fence painter. So when Ron White's done painting the fence, Al looks in and goes, I don't want to pay $1,000 for this. This is awful work. And so Al refuses to pay the money. Well, maybe Ron sues Al for the $1,000, and Al sues both Bob and Ron for the poor paint job. Now, if there had been a novation, Bob couldn't be sued because remember, that makes the original contract go away. But in this scenario, the real original contract is still in force. So the big difference between a novation and a delegation is that, or the two big differences are that in a novation, a contract a party of the contract who is dropping out of the novation, he doesn't have any continuing obligations under the new contract. In a delegation, he does continue to have the responsibility for the duty to be performed appropriately. The other big difference is that Al gets some say-so in the terms of the novation if we have a novation. In a delegation, he's not directly involved. So there are some important differences. If, let's just look here, a new contract is created which states that Ron White, we can see that we have White here, will paint the fence and Bob will no longer have to paint this fence. Upon the signing of the new contract, Al, Bob, and Ron have created a novation. Here we have Bob has no rights or obligations under the new contract, unlike the delegation situation. Okay, let's go back and go through a bank scenario. So we'll call A Ann. Ann owns a house with a $200,000 mortgage, and her bank is Bank One. This is her original contract. Ann sells the house to Bob, and Bob assumes Ann's mortgage. We'll assume it's an assumable mortgage. This assumption is a delegation of the duty to pay. Ann had the duty to pay every month on her mortgage to Bank One, and now she has delegated that duty to Bob, and Bob's taken it up, not because Bob's an awesome, fantastic guy, but because he wants the house, right? And so he is getting the asset, and he is also getting the obligation. But let's say Bob loses his job and he can't make his monthly payments. Well, because this is a delegation situation, Bank 1 can certainly sue Bob, but if Bob is out of work, there's not really much advantage to suing Bob. So Bank 1 can also sue Ann. After all, the original contract was between Bank 1 and Ann. So Ann remains responsible for the payment of the mortgage because she is delegating the duty. And remember, in a delegation, the delegator remains responsible for the transaction. Okay, well, let's assume now that Bob hasn't lost his job. Okay, now he's thinking to himself, gosh, mortgage rates are really low. I want to refinance. So he goes out to Bank 2 and he finances a mortgage, and he uses the loan that he gets from Bank 2 to pay off Ann's original mortgage with Bank 1. So now we have, so this was a delegation up here, right here, delegation. But now we're going to do a novation. Here we go. Okay, and so by paying off the Bank 1 mortgage, this original contract goes poof. It's satisfied. It's complete. And now Bob owes Bank 2 a mortgage. But of course, Ann is not a party to this contract Bob has with Bank 2. And so if Bob loses his job now, Bank 2 can't go to Ann and say, hey, Ann, you got to pay up, because Ann has no obligations under this novation. So you can see how Ann has fallen out of the equation. Ann is not liable if B defaults on Bob's new mortgage. So this is a novation. This is an example of how a delegation and novation are similar in many senses, but there's some important differences between the two. So here's some example language that you might see in an assignment. I assign, obviously the word assign is very good. I assign all my rights, title, and interests. Then the assignee might say, I accept the foregoing assignment. A delegation might start with, I delegate all of my duties and obligations of performance, blah, 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 blah. And if we're the delegatee, we might say, I assume and perform all the duties and obligations delegated. So here's some examples of terminology that might be helpful with drafting the language. Well, at this point, we have completed Chapter 11. We've talked about beneficiaries, both intended beneficiaries and incidental beneficiaries. With respect to intended beneficiaries, we discussed donee beneficiaries and creditor beneficiaries. We talked about the concept of privity, and that, of course, is referring to the two parties, or sometimes more than two parties, who are actually have entered into negotiations and have agreed to a contract. Then we talked about assignments and delegations. We talked about that an assignment is about rights and assets, transferring them to somebody else, and delegations is about the transfer of duties. We also discussed the other similarities and differences between the two. And finally, we talked about the differences between a delegation and a novation, and how both can be useful, but they have somewhat different features. And two of the big differences are a person who's being dropped from the contract, who was in the original contract but not in the second contract. When we have a novation, that person has no continuing responsibility. But if instead that person had delegated his obligation, he does have continuing responsibility. So that's a big difference between delegations and novations. Hopefully this has been helpful for you. As always, please feel free to reach out. Feel free to email me, or even better, stop by my office hours and we can talk in greater detail about this topic. I hope that this chapter has been fun for you. It's one of my favorite in the textbook. I think I enjoy it so much because we kind of get into several different fact scenarios, and I find it interesting to kind of unpack the different scenarios and how they fit together. Again, I thank you for your attention, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.